This is the last session of the day. I'm conscious that there is an exceptional presentation, so I'm keen to start pretty much right away, so we have the opportunity to see it, hear the discussants, and get on with the task. Having said that, I just have about 2 minutes of things I want to say. I'm very pleased to be, notwithstanding what's in the program, chairing this session, because this is a vitally important subject for the economics profession at large, and Australia in particular. It's also a major priority for the ESA, and it was this and for other reasons that it was very timely that the ESA, through Bruce Chapman, was made aware of the project by the International Economic Association to rethink the teaching of economics, and indeed the role of Professor Wendy Carlin in that particular work. Hence this session, which showcases the work that Wendy is leading. We're also very fortunate to have Professors Bill Becker and Rod Maddock as commentators. So I'll be brief with my introductions so we can get on with it. Wendy, I'm pleased to say, is an Oz. She's Professor of Economics at University College London and a Research Fellow at the Centre for Economic Policy Research. A Rhodes Scholar from WA with research interests in macroeconomics, institutions and economic performance, and in the economics of transition. And as I mentioned, she leads an international project to reform the undergraduate economics curriculum. There are more details in your conference notes. Bill Becker, I think we'll have the order that Bill, you'll speak second, if that's be the first commentator, is Professor Emeritus of Economics at Indiana University, Bloomington. His career is long and distinguished in the areas of econometrics, economic education and the economics of education. Bill has a long-standing relationship with Australia, including as Adjunct Professor of Commerce at the University of South Australia. Rod Maddock, who I've known forever, is currently Adjunct Professor at Monash, Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at Victoria University, and President of the Victorian branch of the Economic Society. Rod has a distinguished career that has the rare combination of academy, government and business. So, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt and Bruce and everyone else for most fascinating conference and for giving me the chance to come and bend your ears about how we might teach economics differently. So this cartoon here was a full-page feature in Le Monde in April last year, and you can picture yourself in one of these two positions. So there's a very heated debate going on in France about the teaching of economics, and you may have seen that Jean Toulouse was sucked into this debate in a not entirely friendly fashion over the period since he got the Nobel Prize. So there's a lot of interest there and elsewhere, and I'll try to capture some of that in what I'm going to say. So we've called this project Teaching Economics as if the last 3 decades had happened, and that's supposed to refer to what's happened in economics, what we've learned through economic research over the last 3 decades, as well as what's happened in the world. And somehow we need to bring that into the classroom. And I'd like to, as Matt did as well, acknowledge the support of the International Economic Association that have placed curriculum reform at the top of their agenda for the period up to their next triennial Congress, which will be in 2017, probably in Delhi. So let me just give you a little hint about what we've done. This is a project that started about 18 months ago, and we've got a first-year course up and running in the form of an ebook, and this gives you an idea what it looks like. So you'll know when you register on our website and get access to this for free, whether you're in the right place. So that's what you should see, something called The Economy that starts with these units. And there are about 25, more than 25 actually, academics from around the world who've participated in writing the 21 units. There are 19 of them up on the ebook. And this just gives you a flavor of people who are participating in the pilot. So the top is a core in Cape Town. Then on the top right is Jan Algon at Sciences Po in front of 600 students, and with 600 students in a lecture theatre beneath him. So he's actually in front of 1,200 students, or so he claims. And my colleague Antonio Cabrales at UCL, on the first day, the course was taught there in the 1st of October last year. So we've produced the material, we've put it in the classroom in many settings around the world, and we're also engaged in a more or less continuous process of review, getting feedback from students, from teacher users and prospective teachers, from subject experts who've been very generous as well with their time. And we've had one workshop in New Economic Teaching, which was in Santiago, hosted by the University of Chile in November. We're now in the process of revision. There'll be a new, very heavily revised beta back up for September to go into the classroom again. And our aim is to have the 1.0 version ready for autumn 2017. So the idea is that there would be a sort of stabilization. We wouldn't be continuously destabilizing the people who'd started to use the course. We've got a grant to produce ancillary materials, how to teach guides, slides, but probably even more importantly, methods of testing and also games and simulations, which we're trying to incorporate as much as we can as methods of effective teaching. And there'll be the next workshop is scheduled for, in conjunction with the IEA in Lahore in, actually that will be later this year. So this is it. You can register now. You've been told to turn your phones to silent, but that doesn't stop you from logging on. Can I just suggest that if you do get intrigued enough to log on, then there are instructions which say how to register for core. Now, I know the usual thing is you just do something, but it's quite worthwhile to just watch the little thing or read it that says how to do it, because you have to go through 2 steps and you might get frustrated if you didn't do that. So this is the update as of now. As I mentioned, we've had pilots in the classroom in a number of different places. There's the Sciences Po version was already translated into French. There's an Italian version in Siena, a Spanish translation in the Latin American context. What's, I think, quite interesting is that some of the piloting has been done in public policy settings, so at Columbia and at the Central European University in Budapest. There's a small group that have just finished using it at the University of Sydney. Is there anyone from University of Sydney here? No, okay. Anyway, their scripts are being marked, I think, at the moment. And as I mentioned, Cape Town was part of a pilot, and a new university in Bangalore has just started using it as well. In terms of forward planning, King's College London, Birkbeck are coming on this September, and Warwick probably next year. The Toulouse School of Economics is also very interested. So there's a kind of momentum, a bit of momentum behind it. And it's an international collaboration, and the aim is of this group of people who've come together to do this basically on a volunteer basis, is to close 3 gaps between what we know and what we teach. So that was what I was referring to in the introduction. The questions we're being pressed to answer by students and what we teach, and conventional methods and new interactive learning technologies. So it's really the coming together of those three things, 3 gaps that have produced this mobilization. Who is the pressure coming from? And I think the Australian context really is quite different from the context of most of the people who've been involved in this. The pressure from students was very much driven in the European context by the global financial crisis. In the Chilean context, for example, it was completely different. It was a national uprising of students about the education system more broadly, as well as about what they were being taught in the economics classroom. A second source was from teachers who were somehow dissatisfied but didn't quite know what to do about it. And again, the questions that we were being asked in the wake of the crisis, including by the Queen, about why economists hadn't really recognized the build-up of vulnerability and instability ahead of the crisis, was making people teaching think that they should be both doing, some of them doing different research, but also teaching differently. And thirdly, the third group of pushers, who are stakeholders as well, are employers and public users of economics. The students, it's quite interesting to get an insight by asking your students on the very first day of term, what are the questions that they want answered in their economics course? And these are the answers that were given by first-year students in Bogota in July last year. So the kind of questions: how do different countries manage their economy? How can we understand what is the best economic model for the country? How to bring elements from psychology to economics? If banks are so big, why do they fail? How does history affect today's economy? How to solve the fiscal sustainability problem? So we dealt with that one this morning. How to model in a mathematical way the real world? How to achieve an income distribution that's fair? How to achieve sustainable development? We did the same thing on the first day of class at UCL. It's a fresh-faced first-year student who's wanting very anxiously to know, to understand the causes of the financial crisis. But then we can look at the other end. We can look at graduating students and see what they say. And this is a successful student. That's her diploma, a student from Bogota, who says, before I chose economics, a professor mentioned that economics would give me a way to describe and predict human behavior through mathematical tools. That possibility still seems fantastic to me. However, after semesters of study, I had many mathematical tools, but all the people who I wanted to study had disappeared from the scene. And from the teaching side, from the department chair at a leading university in Turkey, the students, and this I think will echo with at least some of you, the students can handle any problem set we throw at them, but if I ask about the economy, their reasoning is no different from the wisdom. Their reasoning is no different from the wisdom of taxi drivers, and sometimes a bit less well informed. So this is somehow a background to some of the discontent. The Economics Network is a rather well-organised group supported by the Royal Economic Society and most of the economics departments in the UK, runs regular surveys of employers. These are the skills that employers value most in economics graduates. These are the things that come up highest in their polling. Ability to analyse economic, business and social issues, communication of economic ideas, capacity to organise, interpret and present quantitative data. They highlight weaknesses, the ability to apply what has been learned in a wider context. And this was a very recurrent theme from the Government Economic Service, people in the Treasury and the Bank of England, who've also been involved in this project, as well as economists from the private sector. And in terms of the kind of wider audience for economics, Tim Harford said this at the inaugural kind of launch of the project at the Treasury in November 2013. What we teach in economics today determines what people think tomorrow. It's the analysis of tomorrow, the policy advice of tomorrow. It's the political discourse of tomorrow. We can't just ignore it and think it's just a little academic game. It matters. So I hope that with this background, you're sort of a little bit captive in this room, but I don't mind if you have a plane to catch. So let me sketch some responses to that. How could we respond to this? Well, one response, I think, which has been certainly very effective in terms of public education and public understanding of economics, is a kind of freakonomics approach. And when you translate that into curriculum, it's basically saying, well, the content's just fine, but we need better and more empirical examples. There's a second very different approach, And this is the idea that when we teach starting students of economics, we should teach them different schools of economic thought and confront them, if you like, with a kind of tournament between these different schools of thought. And this is the approach that's been argued for very strongly by a number of heterodox economists and pushed very firmly by some of the student organisations that have mobilised extremely effectively in the wake of the financial crisis to try to exert pressure on universities to change the way they teach. And then there's a different approach, and that's what I'm going to sketch, which could be called something like a new paradigm. So let me try to explain what I mean by that. New problems that we have to address sometimes instigate new paradigms in economics. And if we think of Kuhn's definition, then the idea is that what defines a paradigm is what good undergraduates learn. So that's a kind of way of characterizing a paradigm for a discipline. And the really obvious case in economics is the problems that were posed for economists, challenges for economists coming out of the Great Depression, and the marrying together of those problems and the Keynesian revolution in macroeconomic thinking. These new paradigms are eventually codified in a new textbook, and this was the case in economics. So Samuelson, 1948, codified this new paradigm, which incorporated the lessons in economic theory that had been learned in response to the problems of the Depression. The basic content and method of the top introductory economics textbooks has changed rather little in the half century since Samuelson. So that's really the starting point. And it's interesting that in, I think, the most recent issue of the Journal of Economic Literature this year, it says, it's an article about research on teaching economics to undergraduates, and it has this rather telling passage. The choice of a textbook for most principles or intermediate courses probably is inconsequential for learning because of the similarities in content, coverage, and pedagogy found in most textbooks. There are new problems to address, and what we've learned through research in economics in the past 3 decades may be considered to be the basis of a new paradigm, and it's time to give students a new coherent curriculum. There's a major problem in the way that the new learning in economics has typically been incorporated in the curriculum, which is that it's been put at the end of the book. And there are, just to give you an example, of an extremely good and successful intermediate micro textbook, Hal Varian's textbook. If you have a look at it, you'll see that behavioral economics is chapter 30, game theory is chapter 28. Chapter 28 is when social interaction is introduced into economics. And this is an intermediate level textbook. And it's very striking given Varian's own work. Asymmetric information is chapter 37 in the textbook. Externalities, chapter 34. Public goods, chapter 36. So why are the new problems and topics at the end of the book? Not because they're more difficult, not because the prior theory is required to study them, although that may be your response. You may think that this is the explanation, and that's obviously something that we can discuss. But one argument is that they're at the end because putting them at the front would force a change in some of the basic concepts to accommodate the new subject material. What this suggests is that we have to rethink the order in which we teach the combination of new and old concepts. So what this is about is not throwing out the old concepts. It's about thinking how we should best teach what we now know. And that's what got this project up and running. So the question is, how can this be done? What we do is we teach strategic interaction before markets. We teach institutions, so institutions often don't figure in economics principles courses. They may become really way, way down the road. We focus on what actors do and how they interact, that they set prices and wages, they choose technology. We focus on not only on mutual gains, but also on conflicts of interest. We make heavy use of data, and perhaps unusually for economics, we make use of narrative devices to make models memorable. And we show how to see more by looking at less. Okay, that's the whole point of a model, but the question is, how do you really convey that to beginning students of economics? We make repeated use for different problems of a small number of graphical modeling tools. Feasible sets and optimization, forward-looking behavior, I'll show you an example. And what we also do is we have, throughout the ebook, we have buttons called Leibniz, and you can press on the Leibniz to get the calculus. Okay, so it can be taught with and without. Calculus, people say, well, why didn't you call it Newton? Yeah. So the answer is you toss a coin, and that's how Leibniz won. So this is an example of just the graphical similarity that we try to establish in the minds of students. So the first one is just using a feasible payoff set with selfish and altruistic preferences. The bottom one there is the monopolist with an isoprofit curve, and the feasible set is the demand curve. The top one at the right is a bargaining problem, and the bottom one is the macroeconomic policymaker facing trade-offs between low unemployment and stable prices. So this is and you've probably already got the hint that there's no division in teaching between micro and macro. So this is another graphical device that we use. This is forward-looking behavior. In the labour market, this is the firm setting the wage and having to take a view about how the worker's going to respond to the possibility of a spell of unemployment. This is a forward-looking household thinking about savings decisions and the comparison between consumption smoothing and credit-constrained households. We think, and the results from our first pilots have been that we can show economics to be an exciting and highly relevant subject. And I can just tell you that one of the striking things we had fed back to us at UCL after 5 weeks of teaching was strong criticism from the students. And their criticism was that the lectures were the same as what they had read. Our students have never read before. So this was extraordinary. Antonio Cabrales, who was giving the lectures, was rather upset because it meant that he had to think about different things to do in the lectures. But the students were interested enough to read ahead of the lectures. So suppose that an intro course began a little differently from normal. The way we begin is to place the students back in the year 1000, and we've put together a number of data sets. The one on this one up here on the top left is wage data from the UK, from London craftsmen actually, from 1260 to the present. Then there's a technology one up on the right, which is the speed at which news travels from the year 1000. And here we've got the, if you like, the implications of human interaction with our environment. This is the temperature. And what we're doing with creating these charts was to get students' attention riveted on the fact that if you wandered around the world in 1300, actually there was very little difference in living standards across regions of the world. So it's very different from the world they live in, where there are these vast disparities. That's rather a recent phenomenon. So it's very interesting to try and figure out why that happened. And we start with this image of the ice hockey stick and the Great Divergence, making a lot of use of the recent work of economic historians in enabling data sets of this kind to be put together. Something else we do very early on is to introduce measurement questions, both measurement of well-being, but also measurement of inequality. So this is a Lorenz curve for market income and for disposable income for the Netherlands. I'm going to be flashing things through very quickly. It's sort of to give you a temptation, I think, a flavour, and a temptation to explore more deeply yourselves. Oops. So what's happened here? Yeah. Right. So a course that starts like this cannot continue in the conventional way. That's the argument. So the idea is that we have these 5 kinds of problems that have been raised as being subjects that students starting economics are interested in, and that we should have something that we can use economic modelling to enlighten them about. So wealth creation and growth, environmental problems, inequality, unemployment and fluctuations, and instability. To talk about these, we need to introduce concepts that are new to introductory economics, and I'm just going to give you some examples of them as I flash through some more images. So let's start the first one. Many introductory courses in economics really don't talk about the question of innovation and wealth creation. They don't give students a way of thinking about the dynamic process which has generated that upward path of the GDP per capita hockey stick. So what we do, this is the very first model that we teach students, which is starts in the 1600s. Firms are using a labour-intensive technology to produce thread. This is in the textile industry. And then we talk about the 1700s. There's been a change in relative prices. There are profits to be made by replacing spinning wheels by the spinning jenny. And there's also Bob Allen here, who is one of our economists in action, who in a 4-minute video begins his video by saying, I will explain to you why the Industrial Revolution began in England, not in France, not in the Netherlands, and I'll explain why in the 18th century. And he has the data to back up his case. Obviously, this is a big and controversial issue, but it captures the student's imagination that a combination of data and economic models can throw light on this giant question of how economies began to move into a process of continuous per capita growth. The second, okay, so this is some slides from a UCL lecture in October, motivated, if you like, by environmental questions. So this is the slide which recalls the attention of the students back to the heat, the temperature hockey stick, and carbon emissions. Asks them to think about the consequences of human interaction with the environment. And then reminds the students that a few weeks before, they'd actually participated in an experiment. They weren't told what this experiment was about. They were just participants in the experiment in the classroom. So they were participants in a public good game, and then they were shown their results again, which of course at the time they didn't mean much to them. And then they were shown the results of the same experiment in laboratories around the world. So this was a way of introducing strategic interaction, game theory, some basic tools of economic understanding in a context that they found very accessible. And here is another one of the economists in action who is explaining about experiments that he conducted in the field in Latin America, using exactly the game that the students had played in the classroom and where all those results came from around the world. So this is a way of connecting the teaching of economic concepts and economic models with a real-world context that students seem to be able to connect with. Inequality, so Piketty becomes a millionaire, and inequality is on everyone's lips. So this is another lecture. The lecture begins by the students imagining that this is an example of Photoshop, until you tell them that this is not Photoshop, it's Brazil. And it's just one city. So it's not very difficult to then get them engaged in looking at the data. So this is a 3D representation of inequality across the world. So within country inequality is on the horizontal axis, here this left-hand axis, and the countries are ranked in order of GDP per capita. So you can see the skyscrapers up towards the top. And in fact, this chart was tweeted and got a lot of currency in the Twitter world, with everyone asking who was Stephanie and who was Mark. And this is an example of the use of the narrative, but you'll have to read the unit to find out. We can tip the world on its side to show the split in the picture. Okay, so this is the top deciles, obviously on the right of the photograph. To provide an analytical framework for discussing questions of inequality, we have this unit called Property, Contract and Power. Economic institutions, it sounds very vague. How do we get students to understand about the rules of the game and the way in which the rules of the game influence economic outcomes? They get a sense of that from the previous unit when they're introduced to games, to game theory. And here we do it in a different way. So we present them with the constitution of a pirate ship. This is a real pirate ship, and it explains exactly what each person on board the pirate ship does, and it explains exactly how the booty is divided among them. And in fact, we calculated the Gini coefficient for the pirate ship, which was 0.05. And remember, they've already been introduced to the Gini coefficient. And we then find 2 merchant navy ships which captured a Spanish galleon and divided the spoils. And there the Gini coefficient was 0.65. So this is a way that the students can come to understand what we mean by the rules of the game, and the idea of thinking about economic allocations, both in terms of who does what and who gets what. Taking it to a much more contemporary example, this is a stylized Lorenz curve which looks at the land tenure reform in Bengal, and we can show the reduction in the Gini coefficient that was associated with that reform. This is the framing. So the allocation is who does what and who gets what. The standard question with which we're very familiar and very happy to talk about in economics is the left-hand one, which is the allocation efficient? Would there be mutual gains from moving to some other allocation? On the right-hand side, we ask the question, is the allocation fair? And this actually touches on a question that Bruce raised the other day. Is there some allocation that would be fairer? Are the rules of the game that produce the allocation fair? So we're taking on the challenge, and this is very early days, but we're taking on the challenge of teaching students how to think analytically about ethical questions, as well as about the ones we're happier with, the positive questions. And it's possible to do that actually by simple devices. For example, putting students behind a veil of ignorance in a kind of Rawlsian way. And you can get them to start thinking about these kind of ethical questions. Unemployment and fluctuations. We introduce a labour market right from the very beginning by talking about the decision of the firm. So the firm comes before the market. And this is a question of how does the firm solve its incentive problems? How does the firm decide to set the wage? Reminding again about the similarities of coverage. Well, this is a major departure. By introducing a micro-founded view of how the labour market works based on incomplete contracts as their first sense of the labour market, they never have the idea of a clearing labour market as the way the world works. So there's always involuntary unemployment. This makes it very easy to move into macro because you don't have to bring in ad hoc stickiness assumptions to get the macro results that you want to talk about. And the same applies to the treatment of the credit market. So price taking is not taught as the primary case. This is another example of how, by showing how similar things are in an analytical way, it facilitates, it makes the teaching much easier. So students don't have this kind of one damn thing after another feeling, or one separate topic from another. The treatment, the use of concepts and of graphical devices is woven throughout the course. For example, I just showed you a slide about the credit market and the labour market, but we can think about a whole range of dimensions of externalities, a very general view of how the economy works, something that students relate to very, very easily. And if you look down the right-hand side, you can see the names we place on these different aspects of market failure. But by teaching them it within a unified framework, then they're able to simply apply what it says in the first row. When you consider doing this, you affect others, conferring benefits or costs that you don't experience, resulting in a market failure. And there's everything from advising your firm to invest more in R&D to inoculating your child with a costly vaccination. This is just to give a hint about this move from the labour market, from a game which is set up on the left-hand side, a game between the employer and the employee with the best response function, translated into a macroeconomic dimension of the wage curve up at the top, and then we show them an empirical wage curve, show them the data, that's what it looks like in a real economy. So that's data for the US. Now, there's a lot of controversy actually within the group of people who are working on this project about how we should do this. So I'm just going to tell you how it's done at the moment in the current version of the ebook. But if you look in September, you'll find almost certainly, because I think the battle is going on, but I think it's going to turn out differently from this. So this is the question of how do you introduce students to the phenomena of bubbles. Housing bubbles are obviously deeply involved, well, we'll come to that in a minute, but many people take the view that a housing bubble was very important in the build-up to the financial crisis. So if we think of a durable goods market with a demand curve, we get some initial good news and the usual thing happens, the price goes up. But then the response to that initial good news is that you want to hold more of the asset, so that the demand curve shifts again and the price, if you like, goes in the wrong direction. Now, there's an argument about whether this sort of temporary equilibria graphical modeling is really the best way to introduce these ideas to beginning students, and you have to watch this space to see how it turns out. The sense that should be coming from this is that we take a Hayekian, not a Walrasian view of how markets work when they work well, so that we see prices as sending messages, and that's, again, very consistent with using narrative devices in a number of contexts. So you can think about Lincoln blockading the southern ports in the US. No cotton can go out. And then you look at the message that's sent by that through prices all around the world, whether it's to growers of cotton in India or Egypt, whether it's to makers of capital goods for the textile industry in the north of England. And you can literally trace through these changes in prices. But sometimes the messages sent by the prices could be the wrong ones. Do we agree about these things among ourselves? Well, there are some major unresolved and contested issues in economics, and this is a great one to put before students. Do bubbles exist? Farmer, of course, denies that the term bubble has any useful meaning at all. We present a number of these features at particular points where there seems to be a possibility of laying out the disagreement sufficiently clearly and in a way that's sufficiently related to the concepts and models that have been taught for students to appreciate the basis for disagreement, and in some cases how disagreement might be resolved. Then we can also find that occasionally economists agree, and you can have very strange bedfellows. So this is Ronald Coase in bed with Karl Marx, with extremely similar views about the nature of the firm and of authority relations in the firm. There's a wonderful quote from Coase. If a workman moves from Department Y to Department X, he does not go because of change in prices, but because he is ordered to do so. We have to teach, we want to teach, we need to teach, students need to know core conventional concepts as well. So this is an example, testing for perfect competition. Another economist in action, this is Katie Grady, talking about the Fulton fish market in a very vivid way and using the whiteboard that you can just see behind her, drawing diagrams to explain the puzzles that she found when she went down every morning to the Fulton fish market to collect the price of whiting. So this is the basis for a core principles course in economics. It's not a topics course, and it does not assume that students have a conventional principles course alongside. It uses important economic questions and empirical evidence to motivate the development of modelling tools. And we think we will have succeeded if students find economics interesting and useful and want to learn more, and if they get excited by new ways of understanding the world. So I'll just very quickly give you a sense of the sort of time path of what's covered, some of which I've already talked about. So having laid the foundations, we can talk about money, credit, and banks. It's then really easy to talk about macroeconomic topics. They're very used to thinking in a forward-looking way, so they can talk about, they can think about fluctuations and mechanisms that households take in the face of the expectation that circumstances could change. I've nearly come to the end. This is an assignment we gave at the end of the course at UCL. Apply the tools learned to 100 years of economic history from the Great Depression to the financial crisis. So they were given rather detailed instructions about how to use the models that they'd learned, using as a guide work that had been done on the Depression in the course. So they were using these foundations of forward-looking behaviour combined with household balance sheets. Something that had at least disappeared from most teaching of economics is an understanding of balance sheets. So this is household balance sheets in early 29, in the Depression years in the middle, and then in late 1933. So this is the tools they were using that they'd been presented with. A simple multiplier model, but based on an understanding of the forward-looking behaviour in the balance sheet approach, using data, very heavily data-based. Then they had to do it for the financial crisis, looking at the build-up of home equity from the 1990s to 2006, and then the collapse in house prices, and the increase in savings to restore target wealth, tying that to the data on the pattern of changes in demand, the components of demand during the financial crisis. There was an income distribution aspect of as well, so they were given data on the richest and poorest quintile balance sheets. So this is the people who are involved. They're a mixture from all over the world and all kinds of different talent. Turns out that people are good at very different things when they get involved in a project like this. We've got this series of economists in action and a large pool of people who've reviewed the material, many more than I've actually managed to squeeze onto the slide. I showed you this before, which is where the pilots are taking place. So this is a tanker. The tanker has been turned. We know the tanker's been turned before. Think of Samuelson, 1948. It's possible to teach economics in a different way from Marshall, which was the preceding textbook before Samuelson. What does it take? Well, it seems probably to take a combination of new challenges, new problems that economists have been addressing, have been making progress with, and that students are excited and interested in wanting to address. The danger that people sometimes point to is, isn't this throwing the baby out with the bathwater? The response to that is that the baby is maybe not so well, and it's a question of saving the baby from the bathwater rather than throwing the baby out. So that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
No, I think I'll just talk to this. I'll introduce myself there. Rod Maddock. I guess I got this gig partly because I've employed lots of economists in a private sector environment. I was head of strategy and head of research for the Commonwealth Bank, so I had about 100 research people, of whom about half were economists. I'm a sucker for this. My personal career, academic career, started off as an econometrician, then I did macroeconomics, then I went and worked in an economic history department, and then I became an applied microeconomist. So, and then I went to work for the government, then the private sector. So I love it, all right? So that's the basic position. As an employer, what I hated about the graduates you are producing for me were that they knew no accounting. If you're going to employ people these days who are working in the private sector, they actually have to understand some accounting. A lot of your students do not learn any accounting. If you're going to work in the private sector environment, you have to use Excel. You can use all these fancy econometrics packages, but if your students do not learn to use Excel, they are not very useful to me as an employer. Your students have to learn to write. This is the most important thing. Almost all economic research is read. You spend all of your lives writing. Your students cannot write. I used to have to pay for somebody to train every one of my research staff every year and coach the worst ones on a continuing basis. It is a very, very big problem for an employer. And the fourth thing that scared the hell out of me is your students don't look at data anymore. Data analysis, just very, very old-fashioned, look at the bloody data and think, well, that number looks really odd. Have I made a transcription problem, or is there something really interesting about that number? Your students do not do that anymore. So you had some really big failures in how you're actually teaching your students in addition to all these sorts of things. You're not producing the graduates who I thought you could have produced. All right, that's a rant as an employer. Then I'm going to stand back and think, well, as a philosopher, how do I think about this? I was stunned to actually discover that virtually nobody in the Economic Society had ever read Kuhn in Melbourne branch. Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, nobody's ever thought about it. Nobody's ever read it. It's astounding. So the word paradigm you put up there, nobody actually knows who made it famous. Okay, what do I think happened? I think that the Phillips curve broke down as an empirical fact in the 1970s, and we invented a new sort of macroeconomics coming out of Lucas and Sims and Sargent and all those sorts of people. Well, I think we've now had another empirical fact, which is the financial crisis, and it's telling us that that previous model was probably the wrong model. Yeah? That whole, I know a lot of you invested 30 years of your life in that sort of macroeconomics. Well, personally, I just think you've wasted your professional career. So I think that we're actually in the process of seeing another big change in the underlying paradigm. And we're going to say that was a mistake. We'll go back and rethink a lot of what we're doing. And these sort of new Keynesian sort of influence works. Everybody who works in any of the banks, the Reserve Bank, the Treasury, it seems to me, everything you read is actually neo-Keynesian in feel. If not, none of the stuff that you actually are going to spend a lot of your research time doing actually seems to me that anybody in the private sector actually uses. It's all neo-Keynesian, one sort or other. And it's a paradigm shift, and I just think, as I said, we made a mistake after the last big failure of a critical experiment. In terms of teaching first year, I've got 2 points to make about that. The first one is I thought that the most important thing about teaching first year was the students came out with a sense of how the economy works. What do firms do, what do households do, what do the government do, and what do foreigners do for the Australian economy? And when I was teaching first year anyway, I always used to make sure that I kept referring back to the circular flow diagram. Again, you probably insist on your students reading the first 3 chapters before they start class, and you never even talk about the circular flow diagram in class. But one of the nice things about it is it gives a graduating first year student a view as to how the economy works as a whole. And you're just sort of assuming it away, and I suspect you're not even referring back to it in your lectures. The other thing that I thought was really important, and I think which is pretty disgraceful, is that most professors no longer teach first year. I really thought as a senior professor it was your obligation to teach the first semester and first year, because you are the people who understand the discipline best, who've got the best range of stories, who've got the broadest range of experience, and what we're getting here is a whole lot of really engaging stories to teach students about how to use economics, how to apply this stuff. What are the interesting ways? How can I actually think about that problem? What's wrong with electricity pricing, or you know, what's wrong with the American housing contract or something like that? But it is the senior staff, I think, who've got the obligation to teach first year. And I just think far too often it's being delegated to somebody who just hopped off the plane from Indiana or Duke or whoever, wherever, and they're just lumped into the first year class and they just teach a vanilla course, which is not very interesting. And because they've got such narrow experience, they don't have the stories to tell the students. And that's why the teaching, I suspect, is not getting the messages across which we really need to. And this is going to help us in some ways, but I think you've all got a real responsibility to get in front of your classes. Thank you.
Once Bill's finished, we'll have time, I think, for about 10 or so minutes of questions.
I recognize that I'm the last thing between a wine, a beer, or whatever else you're going to entertain yourself with. So I'm going to keep it short, at least I'm going to try to keep it short. Wendy, on 2 different occasions, had this particular slide up. If you haven't seen this article, I strongly recommend that you read it. It's quite good and done by some close friends of mine. But that also is going to tie in to where I think Wendy has an uphill fight. She's swimming upstream. In particular, the whole idea of textbooks today is market-driven. Right here in Australia, a quote you should be familiar with, if you're not, comes from David Colander, done in an Australian journal, in which he laments the fact that he entered textbook writing with the intention of changing the way macroeconomics was taught. He quickly found out that to sell textbooks, that was not possible. The marketers dictate what goes into the books. In fact, I just heard the statement about we needed to teach Excel. I had a textbook that I came out with Excel in it to teach statistics in the early 90s. It was a total bomb. Now, my friend Bill Wallstead uses this and throws it back at me and says, oh, market imperfections, right, Bill, ha, ha, ha. No, the fact of the matter is, I was doing something that nobody was doing at the time in the teaching of statistics. It wasn't being done. The book didn't sell. I still didn't learn my lesson. I tried again. It bombed. I tried a third time. 3 daughters. I had to put them through college, so I used the upfront money to put them through school. But what I quickly learned was that unless I was willing to listen to the marketers, unless I was willing to listen to what I was being told, my books weren't going to sell. And I take my hat off to David for using an Australian journal to tell us the truth. This even goes beyond this. I think about a conversation that we had with Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman, as you know, won a Nobel Prize in part for the new trade theory. In his lecture, he has his Nobel Prize lecture, he has an example of why comparative advantage breaks apart. And the example is based on Germany importing Peugeots when they're exporting Volkswagens, and importing wine to France when they're exporting wine to France. Comparative advantage doesn't work. That's his example. But if you take a look at his textbook, which we have done for another paper, Jim Self and I, and all the textbooks, there's absolutely no mention whatsoever of the new trade theory for which he is a major contributing author to the point he won a Nobel Prize for it. Why? The market dictates. Now, the idea that Wendy's putting forward is a good one, but she's up against some real strong powers. For example, the authors of the Journal of Economic Literature article, Sam Allgood, wonderful man, Bill Wallstead, my most famous graduate student from the University of Minnesota, John Siegfried, a dear friend who I'll be with in Adelaide, they're past chairs of the AEA Committee on Economic Education. What does the AEA Committee on Economic Education advocate? And oh, do they get mad at me for saying this isn't the truth? 20 standards. Economic literacy is 20 standards. And by God, if you're not putting out students who can pass the test of understanding of college economics, you're not economically literate. This has been going on since the 50s. It goes all the way back to G.L. Bach, who was the chair of the AEA committee. Now, there's lots of naysayers saying this is not a good idea. For the past 15 years, I've been saying, look, we've got to bring modern economics into the teaching of economics. And my dear friends, they just get upset from hearing me say this, because we've got to have these basic 20 ideas, and we've got to get those students at least to understand those basic 20 standards, work those basic 20 standards. I'm not alone in this, though, but I still think my best title in this was Quit Lying and Teach the Controversies. So I was very pleased to see the slide that Wendy had up saying, look, there's not agreement on these things. Smart people can disagree, and we have economists, they're going to disagree, but they disagree in a very certain way. They have certain tools they're using to disagree. It's not like the newspapers or religion. There's ideas they're using, and when we look at facts, when we look at real data, people can read that data differently. But in fact, if you take a look, for example, at Molinville was one of the people who came along and said, look, we can't keep teaching dogma. We have to have people looking at data. Alan Kruger, chair of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, he comes out and says, look, it's data. Modern day economics is data. Yet we're not putting data in the classroom. Wendy is. And here we have her. She's saying, hey, let's get modern day economics into the classroom. I applaud her for that, but again, I go back to my opening statement. I think it's going to be an uphill fight. I wish her well in doing it, but she's up against a big establishment. Thank you.
We we have some time for some questions. I'm mindful that the conference finishes sharp at 4:30, and I don't propose that we'll continue much beyond that. But could I invite questions from the attendees here? Bob, then Paul, I think.
I mean, one of the themes that's been running through the comments is that the economic profession responds to the incentive. Presumably it must be, otherwise we wouldn't be where we were, but that's a joke. So the question really is, what can we do to change the incentives and to change the structure easily? Now, I have one idea which is on the table now, is whether we'd be better off if we made economics more of a graduate degree. By that I mean more of a master's degree. People are discussing that now. One way of thinking about that might be the Melbourne model sort of idea. The reason I bring that up is that I also agree that you should do some accounting. And I think you should do some stats, some programming, some philosophy. You know, the list goes on and on. You just can't fit it all in. And so the question then is, you know, should we move economics back further? Now, that would be easy to do. You know, Melbourne and so on. The question is whether that would make any difference. But it would mean that you've got the chance, for example, of teaching people to write better. Because in an economics course, you know, if you're working hard to get your A-star articles and your research grant out, the last thing you want to do is mark essays. My course, the exam is essays, and I can assure you that 15% of the kids come, and when I tell them it's an essay exam, they leave. Because they say they've never written an essay. And I'm not going to teach them to write an essay. So maybe we could change, that. The second thing is, who teaches economics? Now, economics is increasingly being taught by economists with North American type training. There's no reason why you can't have economics taught in the arts faculty by historians. It would be a different sort of economics. Or economics taught by people who do more, you know, accounting type or quantitative type stuff. So, you know, you could broaden the teachers, not within the economics department itself, but within the university having more pseudo department. And universities do that. They have public policies at schools, you know, more mathematical schools. Maybe we can do institutional changes, stuff like that. So what I'm suggesting is, rather than thinking about how the course should change, which I think is important, think about what structural changes might bring about the sort of changes you want.
Could I suggest we take that one and pop in a couple of other questions and then have the opportunity to respond on this? Paul, thank Paul.
Wendy, my question's for you. I think it's really lovely starting off with those big sort of data challenges, those bits of data that prompt questions. But what do you do, if anything, about the theory and the fact that the theory has evolved over time in response to controversy and political events? Is that something that has any purchase with students? Is that something you've tried at all in the course, and giving them a sense that economics didn't just descend from the sky about 10 years ago, that it's actually evolved through a messy process?
Yes, my question is for Wendy also. It's really brave to think about a new curriculum, but of course you're always going to have opponents and everybody who's taught in the previous curriculum because their human capital is on the line. So the question is a little bit, how do you herd the cats, right? If you've assembled a team of people, how do you get them to agree on a new curriculum? Because that's always seemed to me almost an impossible task to even attempt. It's best to just, have competing products and see which one wins in the marketplace rather than getting consensus, because I think that's fairly hopeless for the reasons out there.
Okay, well, to hold it at that, the next round of questions, but when you
Yeah, thank you.
to respond.
Yeah, okay. Right.
Bob's questions, I think it's very defeatist, Bob. I think we can definitely...
The old guys always get depressed.
Yeah, I'm disappointed actually.
I'm arguing all kinds of institutional change.
Yeah. So that may be possible, but I think what's very striking is that the material that we put up, school teachers have now got very excited about it, and they're thinking of how they can adapt it to teach in the secondary school level. So I think that it would be a shame if we said, well, we economists are too lofty to teach economics to undergraduates. And to me that would be very disappointing, because students are really hungry to study this subject, and if we do it right, then I think we can attract, it's a great way of attracting talent into the subject, retaining students who get intrigued by economics. So I think, sure, the more settings in which economics is taught in an interesting and engaging way, the better. But I don't think we should give up on undergraduates. The question of who teaches, this is part of the reason why we decided to do something, to produce material, to get it out there, was that it is difficult for teachers who are simply assigned to teach a first year course. The easiest thing, because they're trying to write their next paper, is to use a very standard course, even if they find that boring. What I think we're trying to do is to connect the possibility for new content with new ways of using class time. And it seems possible to incentivize students to do reading, engage with interactive material on their own, and then the teacher, who feels much more comfortable in the classroom about teaching models, about teaching about measurement, about doing games. If you've got some videos and show people that it's not that scary, having 300 students running around a lecture theatre like this playing a market game, as long as you don't tell health and safety, then there are other things you can do in the classroom. If you don't feel confident about talking about the long sweep of economic history, for example. So we have to be much more imaginative about the best use of face time with students than many people in economics have typically been. Paul's question about the evolution of economic thinking, one thing that we've done in the material we've produced is to have a series of past economists, and we were really heavily criticised that we call them past economists. So they've been renamed great economists, and hopefully that's less problematic. But what's really great is to show, at the moment when you're trying to teach a particular aspect of economic modelling, addressing a particular problem, you show the link to how that was thought about, for example, by Smith or by Mill or Coase, and people come in and out. So you also see that economists have frequently made contributions across a number of different fields. So I think it is possible to make that rather interesting for students. And these great economists often had quite interesting lives as well. Paul, about consensus, yes, well, and this relates a bit to Bill's point about swimming upstream, which someone said was, well, just think about salmon, and how fantastic it is, these leaping salmon going upstream. So I think that's how we should think of it. Yes, consent. We believe what we're doing is a disruptive publishing model. Okay, we are stirring things up. We're putting something out there. We're inviting people to make use of it however they like. It's free, open access. Anyone can use it, and there will be some diversity. In fact, I think more diversity is good. The problem, I think the problem more that there's too narrow, too homogeneous a curriculum in place at the moment. So stirring it up is good. And in terms of publishers, what's been very striking is that several textbook publishers have shown great interest in this product, and even accepting the condition that the electronic version has to remain free online. So the publishers, I think, are under pressure, and so maybe there's some hope from this kind of disruptive model.
Very good. James, would you like to make any comment? Okay. Could you identify yourself? And there's one more over there, and that would be the...
Tony Chambers from Goldsmiths London. Politics actually introduces students to different schools of thought, so why can't economics do that?
That's a good question. And
my question is about professionalizing first year teaching. So I myself am one of these fresh off the plane people who's about to be dumped on Wednesday in front of 450 students for my first time teaching such a large class. I've never gone above 50 before. Do we need to think about this as being a different type of teaching to the rest of the university classes that we do in, say, third year or an honours class? And does there need to be a category of professional teachers for these big 500 or 1,200 people it was at Sciences Po, you said? Do we need to have a different profession there, as it were?
Yeah, sure, I go. Yeah, so reverse order. Some people take much more, get much more pleasure, if you like, at playing to a crowd than others. And so I think there will be people who are attracted to doing this. I mean, all the people involved in this project are research active economists. They're not special teachers at all. But I think we just have to be much more imaginative about what to do in the classroom. So I think that's really the message. If we've got great material, then we can trust students. We trust them, but we incentivize them actually. Why we got them reading the material beforehand was not entirely magic. It was because they had to do something within 48 hours after a lecture. The thing they had to do attracted no credit, so you could say it wasn't particularly powerful incentive, but nevertheless they did it. So I think that we can, all of us can be much better teachers and actually have much more fun if we decide what's best done in the classroom and what's best done through other mechanisms. And that touches again a bit on Bob's point about how do we assess this. And this is also relates back to Rod and how do we get students to write. And that's where I think there really is expertise elsewhere in universities, and students can be directed to skills labs. We have one actually in our department which concentrates on writing skills. But then we have to use the writing skills in our economics courses because that's the whole point. So we do get them to write, and we get them, we have a part of the exam where they have to write. And it still has to be read, but it can be, there are mechanisms through which you can delegate the marking even of essays. And those techniques have, I think, have become much better over recent years. The final comment was, can't we teach history of thought? Absolutely. I have think there's no reason.
Different schools, not just this.
Yeah, different schools of thought. Yeah, sure. That's not what this project is about. But there's no objection to teaching different schools of thought. I don't think it's a good way to teach a first course in core economics to students, because I think we can do much better in terms of getting them excited about economics and what economics can do when we draw insights from a very wide range of schools of thought and of economic research. So I wouldn't want to narrow it down to particular schools or even a school of thought.
We might just conclude on that, but if I may, I'll just add one remark. I remember vividly my first year economics at ANU in 1971, and Rod, it was taught by a professor, Burge Cameron, and there was a class of 600, and he began by saying, look to the left of you, look to the right. One of you will be here next year, And I do remember, as there were a lot of public servants during that time, but one of the things I do remember was that it was not a particularly well motivated course. If I may make a comment on this, I mean, what I like particularly about this approach, that probably reflects my subsequent preference to work in public policy, is that it actually spins it round back on the wicked problems. What are the things that actually cause interesting issues or interesting questions in economics, and how do we think about it? So I wish you every success. It's been a very good presentation. Could I ask you all to thank Wendy, Rod and Bill?